Good evening, everybody. Thank you. Welcome. I think it's right on 7. So we will get started. My name is Bob Felch, and we're delighted to have all of you here this evening to the 8th annual Sconset History Night here at the historic casino. This evening is brought to you by the Siasconset Historical Research Group. That's a mouthful. And we call it SHRG for short, and that works for us. So SHRG is bringing this event to you this evening, as we have done for the previous 7 years. The group operates under the umbrella of the Nantucket Historical Association and in cooperation with the Nantucket Preservation Trust, the Sconset Trust, and On the Isle. And On the Isle will be providing refreshments at the end of the evening, lemonade, I believe. So we thank them for that. Back in 2009, when we were pulling SHRG together, it actually, if I remember correctly, Paul, Judy, and I were out on a fishing boat talking about how someday we would organize a group to focus on the history of Sconset. And that was probably 10 or 11 years ago. And from that point, we come to tonight, the 8th annual Sconset History Night. But back in the spring of 2009, I wrote a little blurb for the Sconset Trust newsletter talking about SHRG, and I'm going to give you a little anecdote from that article that I wrote because I think it was really good. Did you know that a small group of Sconseters and Islanders interested in advancing the preservation and documentation of Sconset history has come together and is now functioning under the umbrella of the Nantucket Historical Association? The idea man behind the formation of this group is Paul Judy, local historian and inveterate researcher. In collaboration with the NHA, the Preservation Trust, the Sconset Trust, and On the Isle, Paul has defined a longer-range plan for collecting, archiving, and sharing historical information about Sconset land, structures, people and community groups, and institutions. We could change the slide, please. An initiative to work on house and family histories is already underway. Paul has brought together a programming team back in 2009. I think the date at the bottom of that slide is the date of our first Sconset History Night. Ben Simons was involved at the time. He's no longer on island. Betsy Tyler, who is our presenter this evening, has been here from the get-go. Michael May, who's sitting in the back of the room somewhere. Is Michael May here? There he is. Who's the executive director of the Nantucket Preservation Trust, and a guy named Bob. That's me. Plans are underway for the first presentation of the Siasconset Historical Research Group with a focus on Sconset land development, the history of. And Betsy and I were recollecting the first evening we were here. We had a big table over here with 5 presenters. The people who were here were stuck here for an hour and a half. And I was the last to go, and I saw a few sleepers in the crowd, and I heard a few snores too. We've learned our lesson, and we have a very compact presentation for you tonight, and I think you'll enjoy it. So subsequently, we've heard presentations, and maybe we can, in the second annual, there you go, on the Sconset Actors Colony. And then the next slide, we had a presentation on the Main Street houses and actually a juxtaposition of the Main Street houses here in Sconset and in town and some common ownership between those homes, and it was quite interesting. And then we had an excellent presentation on the life of Edward F. Underhill, of the Underhill cottages over on the south side of Sconset, the good side of the tracks, where I live. Thank you. And then, let's see, we also, 2 years ago, we had a presentation that was titled New Light and Old Landmarks, and we talked about the history of the Siasconset Golf Club, which is locally known as Skinner's, maybe not anymore, but it has been known as Skinner's, and also featured a keeper's log for the Sankaty Head Lighthouse that the NHA came into possession, and Betsy gave a great presentation on that. So we've covered a lot of topics over the years, and then last year we had a focus on the cottages on Front Street, Broadway, Shell, and the other one. What is the other street? Thank you. Okay, so we encourage all of you to support the member organizations that sort of support this organization, the NHA, the NPT, the Sconset Trust, and On the Isle. The membership in SHRG is free, and you are all members of SHRG. Congratulations. So, I think the most important thing for all of us as modern dwellers in Sconset is to focus on oral tradition and bring forward stories that we know from our families or from friends and share them with the group that is now overseeing SHRG. You may not have been here a long time, but there are stories that come with a home, or you hear gossip, and we'll accept gossip, though we might have to verify the historicity of it. In any event, also, of course, photos are very important. The NHA has a wonderful photo database online. I was just on there today looking for some photos. And any private written communications are important, and documentations. So the current team is Betsy Tyler, who is the Obed Macy Research Chair and Research Librarian at the NHA, and Michael May, the Executive Director of the MPT, and Bob Felch, a man without a title. So, as mentioned, we will be gathering after the presentation in the back for lemonade. We do have some books on the history of Sconset which are for sale. And the NHA, of course, has a treasure trove of books that are published on the history of the island, some specific to Sconset. And those will not be available here, but you can order them online. So, without further ado, I would like to present Betsy Tyler, Obed Macy Research Chair and Research Librarian at the NHA, who will present Sconset Man of Mystery. Betsy?
Bob promised to stand up here and fan me, but I'm going to let him sit down. Thanks, everybody, for coming out again. It's always so gratifying to see Sconseters interested in their history, even on the hottest, most humid nights of August, which is when we always seem to do this. So maybe we should change our date. But I really appreciate your attendance here. I hope you'll find this interesting. Tonight I'm going to talk about someone who's he's not a common name in Sconset, and I think he's been largely forgotten. And I'd like to thank Paul Judy for encouraging this investigation into the life of William J. Flagg, who turns out to be a most interesting character. I think it's fair to say that he's probably one of the least known but most influential figures in late 19th century development in Sconset. Why is that? Well, Flagg acquired all the land you see in this photo taken from Sankaty Light and more, from Nosegay Lane to Rosalie's Lane, and then from Ann's Lane to the lighthouse was all Flagg property. He laid out house lots that allowed for large homes and large yards, very different from the village concept that gave Sconset its character. And he preserved the ancient footpath along the Bluff. Edward Fitch Underhill, who was the subject of our talk here a couple years ago, he and William J. Flagg were in Sconset at the same time in the early 1870s. And they were both really influential developers of Sconset, but there's no indication that I've been able to discover that they ever interacted. Underhill was a well-known, beloved member of the summer community, a writer, humorist, and historian, and his love of Sconset was obvious. In the period from 1870 to about 1900, if you look in the online Nantucket newspaper database, if any of you have ever explored that, it's really great. You can do a keyword search for any topic. If you put in Underhill's name, you get more than 100 hits for that 30-year period. If you enter Flagg's name, maybe a dozen. So that's why I refer to him as Sconset's man of mystery. He and Underhill had a lot in common, but they appear to have had very different temperaments. So tonight I'm going to share with you some of the things I've learned about Mr. Flagg. And for the record, I'd like to thank his great-great-nephew, Peter Flagg Maxson of Alston, Texas, for sharing some family information with me. He just sort of serendipitously got in touch with me a year or so ago about his great-great-uncle, and so it sort of spurred a conversation and correspondence, and I've learned a lot about the Flagg family from him. And I'll tell you a little bit about more about Flagg's family, which includes a relationship to this man. I just had to put that up. And I'll tell you more about that. And I'll share what I've learned about Flagg's many interests and accomplishments, which include his novels, his books about wine, and the grand opus of his life, this book. This is Yoga or Transformation, a comparative statement of the various religions, dogmas concerning the soul and its destiny. It's really an amazing thing that he published. It was published on his 80th birthday, which was the day he died. So I think that's just really phenomenal. So let's start with Flagg's family, going back a few generations. Ebenezer Flagg of Newport, Rhode Island, was William's great-grandfather. He was born in 1710 in Boston and moved to Newport, where he married the lovely Mary Ward. She was daughter of the governor of Rhode Island and a descendant of Roger Williams. Both of those portraits that you've just seen there were painted by an artist named Robert Feek in 1749, and they're part of a really important Flagg portrait collection that William J. Flagg once owned. Ebenezer and Mary had 9 children. William J. Flagg's grandfather was their son, Dr. Henry Collins Flagg, who married Rachel Moore Alston. She was the widow of William Alston and the mother of the famous portrait painter Washington Alston, who painted her portrait, which is the next slide. I'm afraid it's not a very clear portrait, but there she is, Rachel Moore Alston. She married Dr. Flagg in South Carolina in 1785, and he was in South Carolina as Deputy Apothecary General of the Southern Division of the Army. And he and Rachel lived the Southern plantation life, which included owning 43 slaves. They had 3 children. Their son, Henry Collins Flagg Jr., born in South Carolina, attended Yale University, and later became mayor of New Haven, Connecticut. And he's William J. Flagg's father. So that's the brief family tree of William, who was born in Connecticut, and whose roots in this country, or rather branches in this country, include prominent, wealthy, very well-educated people. William was one of 5 children. His 3 brothers were all artists, and all professional artists, well-respected artists, who had some guidance from their uncle, Washington Alston. But supposedly the family says that the real talent came from Rachel Moore Alston. She handed that down to, or passed it down to Washington Alston and to her other sons, all except William J. Flagg, who obviously did not paint, that we know of. One of his brothers, George W. Flagg, also summered on Nantucket. He owned a house at 12 Westminster Street, and that's George. Looking like a bohemian artist. He's with his daughter, Georgina, and his granddaughter, and that photograph is from 12 Westminster Street. Now, William's sister, he had one sister, Rachel. She had a daughter who married Cornelius Vanderbilt, whose granddaughter, Gloria Vanderbilt, is the mother of Anderson Cooper. So that's that's that connection. So William J. Flagg and Anderson Cooper have a common. Okay, can you hear me?
Technical difficulties.
I'm so sorry. That seems to have done it. Okay. In 1852, William J. Flagg married Eliza Longworth of Cincinnati. She was a daughter of Nicholas Longworth of a wealthy and prominent family. They had no children together, but they raised a niece of William. Her name was Rosalie, and she was the youngest child of William's brother, Jared B. Flagg, one of the artists, who was twice a widower of a very large family. They took in his youngest brother, Rosalie. Now, William was an attorney and a writer. And I listed here some of the books that I discovered that he wrote. The first one, which is Abuses in the Navy. You can only imagine what that is. Then there was a published speech that he made to the Ohio House of Representatives. And then you see a couple titles about wine and growing of grapes. He was interested in viticulture or vine culture. And I'll tell you a little more about that in a moment. And then he wrote two novels, A Good Investment and The Story of the Ohio, and Wall Street in the Woods, which is another novel. And then the grand opus of his life, Yoga or Transformation. So, William was introduced to wine culture, or vine culture, by his father-in-law, Nicholas Longworth. And eventually he acquired large acreage in Ohio, where he grew grapes and made wine. Thank you. Okay. And in Ohio, I don't know if you heard me, but he had large acreage in Ohio where he grew grapes and made wine. And on this land, he and his wife Eliza built Buckhorn, a log cabin, which I find really intriguing as it says something about how William and Eliza like to escape to little-known locales. This is Buckhorn, which is really unusual. In a book about the historical collections of Ohio, a book that was written and illustrated by a man named Henry Howe in 1891, here's a description of Buckhorn. In 1855, just before the war, under the magic of money, a curious structure arose on the hills near the lines of Adams and Scioto counties. It was in a beautiful country some little way back of Buena Vista. The cottage was of peeled white poplar logs, resin varnished and mortar daubed. It was therefore peculiar. I love that description. It was 74 feet long by 22 feet broad in two parts, on the plan of an ordinary double cabin, with a 17-foot wide floored and roofed space between them. A stone kitchen in the rear is out of view. The chimneys were also of stone. Vines were placed to climb over it, which they accomplished in profusion. The summer breezes fluttered their leaves, and the autumnal frost put on them a blush. In the Buckhorn lived for a term of years its owner and architect, Honorable William J. Flagg, and his wife, a daughter of the late Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati, with occasional guests to share the romance of their solitude. On writing to him as an old friend and schoolmate how he came to build it and what he did when there, he gave this characteristic reply. And these are the words of William J. Flagg. In 1852, I bought a 50-acre tract of hill land near Buena Vista on the Ohio. Bought it because I supposed there was valuable stone on it. This purchase led step by step to the acquisition of something over 9,000 acres adjacent. It's a lot of land. I cleared off woods and planted orchards and vineyards to the extent of more than 100 acres. Opened a quarry, built a tramway, until my operations culminated in a log house on a hilltop, a mile east of the county line and half-mile from the river, where in different broken periods of time from 1856 till 1868, we spent about 5 years. It was mighty like being out of the world, but none the worse for that. Tells you a little something about William. And then in 1870, about 1870, the cabin went up in flames. No one discovered why, but shortly after that, William J. Flagg arrived on Nantucket in Sconset. And here I'd like to share some recently discovered images of William and Eliza Flagg. It's interesting that William's great-great-nephew, the man I corresponded with, he had no photos of William and Eliza and didn't know where to find any, and I looked online and couldn't find anything, but here we have them at the NHA. They're a part of a photo album that was kept by a Sconset woman, Eliza W. Mitchell, in the late 19th century, and she has labeled them Lawyer Flagg and Mrs. Flagg. Since it's a Sconset photo album and there were no other flags on the island except the flags in Sconset, and William J. Flagg was a lawyer, I think it's safe to say that that's William J. Flagg and Eliza. So we're thrilled to have those images of them, and I've shared those with his descendants. So what brought William and Eliza to Sconset? Who knows? That's a question I have not been able to answer. And here I'd like to thank Paul Judy for his research into the Sconset connections of William and Eliza Flagg. Neither of us has yet determined what led Flagg to choose Sconset as his next getaway after Buckhorn, the cabin, went up in flames. We know that he purchased 300 acres of land in Sconset in 1873. And in 1875, he built his first house on the Bluff, just south of Nosegay Avenue. And if you look at this map of Sconset, this bird's eye view, beautiful bird's eye view map from 1881, if you look all the way to the right, the furthest house along the bluff there is, I'm fairly certain, Flagg's house that was built in 1875. It was the furthest one out at that point. So our friend Edward F. Underhill, who we know is the other Sconset developer who's very different from Mr. Flagg, he recounts the story of the construction of this house for Flagg, and he says it's the genesis of Sconset's development boom. And Underhill, who is a very humorous writer, this is what he said. One day in 1875, carpenter Asa Jones was nearly paralyzed with astonishment. Mr. William J. Flagg of New York told him he wanted a house built in Sconset, and a Sconset house at that. When he had recovered from the shock, Asa put his hand to his starboard ear and asked Mr. Flagg to say it again and say it slow. It was repeated, and the word Sconset was pronounced with an extra big capital S. The house was built and was occupied by Mr. Flagg and his family for several years. It was then sold to Deacon Chittenden of Detroit, and he and his family each season waxed joyful that they lived within the first house to illustrate the Renaissance of Sconset architecture. This first house built by Flagg, I have recently discovered, was known as Breezy Bluff. I have a copy of a letter that Eliza Flagg wrote from Breezy Bluff to a nephew. And although it's undated, it appears to be from 1876, a year after the house was built. And she writes, "We are this summer in our own house built last summer. I wish you could see it. It is as lovely as can be, furnished with almost anything 100 years old. The chairs are the old style, common wood with sticks down the back, some painted red, others yellow, and some bronze green. The bureaus have brass handles to the drawers. Your uncle and Rosalie go in bathing nearly every day and greatly enjoy it. We are situated close to the bank with the raging ocean beneath. We have not suffered with heat any one day. Gee, things have changed. Rosalie bathes in the air from morning till night and is happy as a bird. She is now studying German, and I have her governess with me, but she only studies 1 hour each day. She is just what we could all could wish her to be. Lovingly, Aunt Eliza. And so she's talking about Rosalie, the niece that they raised, who would have been 10 years old in 1876, cavorting in the waves with her uncle and speaking German. So Flagg sold this first house on the Bluff to Chittenden in 1883. It's no longer standing. He also sold adjacent land to the south to Henry K. White of Detroit, and White developed his hamlet of houses that was known as White's Hamlet, or Detroitville, and that's the site of the Wade cottages. And if you look at this map, where it says Atlantic Ocean at the bottom, if you go directly above the letter N, you see that little grid of 4 houses on one side of a lane and 4 houses on the other. That's White's Hamlet, where Wade Cottages is today. And the next house, just south of Nosegay Lane, is Flagg's first house. So next to, okay, let me get this straight here. Flagg owned the property then from the Wade Cottages to Nosegay Lane up to Rosalie's Lane, and it's just occurred to me in doing this research that Rosalie's Lane's named for Rosalie Flagg, the niece, which I don't know that anybody knew that before. So that's a little discovery. So he owned that land, and then there was a bit of land owned by somebody else, and then he owned everything else from Ann's Lane up to the lighthouse. So Sconset had become really popular by 1883 when Flagg sold this first house to Chittenden. There were more and more summer visitors. The Ocean View House had been built and was a center of summer activity. And the development of Sunset Heights south of the gully brought large homes to that area, along with the little Underhill cottages on Pochick, Evelyn, and Lily Street that were springing up. So the Flaggs, who had so enjoyed their 9,000 acres of solitude in Ohio, in their cabin there, they wanted to get out of the village, I think. And they decided to build a house farther away from the center of activity, away from the bustle and the festive summer crowd. And they built Flagship at 55 Baxter Road, north of Ann's Lane. And it was probably built, I'm thinking, and I don't know, and I've heard from current owners that there is a date on the on somewhere in the house that's 1888 or 1889. I was thinking it might have even been built earlier because the Flaggs sold one house and they would have had to have somewhere else to go. He had all this property, could well have begun the house before then. But in 1885, Flagg filed this subdivision plan for what he called Sankaty Heights. And we're fairly certain that Flagship is the first house in Sankaty Heights. It's 87 lots on both sides of a boulevard there. It's a huge amount of property. So this view of Flagship, which I think is an amazing photograph, is from the late 1880s or early 1900s, and it's really spectacular. And I don't think you can probably see it clearly, but you can go online to our image database at the NHA and look up the photos of Flagship. But you will see that on the roof, you probably can't see, in front of the chimney, above the little skylight, is a ship. There's a ship model on top of the house. So he's not only played on his name, Flagg, it's a flagship property for this part of the island, but there's a ship on the Flagg house, which is pretty phenomenal. And if you look through the columns on the porch there, you see Sankaty light framed in the background. It's really a beautiful setting. There are people sitting there on the porch, probably Eliza Flagg and maybe a grandchild and perhaps a maid or a governess. And this next slide shows, it's from the same era, shows Flagg, it's a little blurry, but you see the bluff here, which is it's kind of a remarkable image that shows the footpath, and it shows how much land there was between Flagship and the edge. And I don't know how that compares with today, but I imagine it's less. We have a couple interior photographs of Flagship from the probably 1890s. And you see it's very simple summer house, a brick fireplace, wallpapered walls in between the beams. There's one of those simple painted stick-back chairs that Eliza wrote about. And here's another image that shows another room, simple fireplace again, summer furniture. It's really quite bright and beautiful. We have in our image collection at the NHA a lot of photos of exteriors of houses. Interiors are much more rare. People just, in this era particularly, just did not photograph the inside of their houses. So we're really lucky to have this. We don't really know much about Flagg's time on Nantucket at Flagship, but can only imagine the summer days with his wife Eliza and with Rosalie, his niece, with his brother George Flagg and George's family and other visitors. The casino was not yet built, so there was no social gathering place, but one wonders if the Flaggs would have been interested in that anyway. They seemed a little reclusive. And I've learned just a little bit, and this is just the beginning research on William Flagg. There's, I'm sure a lot more out there, but I've learned a few things about the Flaggs during the 1890s. Rosalie Flagg, who had spent summers at Flagship with her aunt and uncle, married William D. Jaffray of New York City in 1890. And they have discovered had a house on Quince Street for a number of years. Rosalie died in 1950, and I think they own, I'm not sure which house, I think I know, but figure that out. In 1891, Eliza Longworth Flagg died. And this is really curious. After her death, her supposed love child appeared, a man who claimed that he was her child born before she married William J. Flagg, and he had been fostered in a family in Kentucky. He came forward claiming a portion of her estate. And this caused quite a sensation at the time in Cincinnati, where it went to trial. And William had to take the stand to testify that his wife was a Virgo intacta when he married her. So, there's no DNA test at the time. I suppose, people could be dug up. But anyway, ultimately, the case was thrown out. And there's someone writing a book about this now, a man named Dan Wallert in Ohio, and I will let you know when it's published so I can learn more about this episode. So then in the next year, 1892, is when William left a pretty important legacy to Sconset. He made certain that the path from the village to the lighthouse, a path that probably dated back to Native American times, and certainly to the early years of the whaling stations and fishing stations out here, he made certain it was preserved as a public way for anyone who wanted to use it. He left it in trust to the proprietors of Nantucket, who in turn gave it to the town of Nantucket, and the town voted to seek title to the path from the Massachusetts Land Court, which they acquired, and we have it today. Every deed to property along the bluff includes the stipulation that, that this path is open to the public. So even though he was a very private individual, he was a man who wanted to share the natural attractions of his land with the public, which is admirable. And what he knew, he could see from his house that walking to the lighthouse on a summer day was a popular activity for Sconseters, and the direct route, the most beautiful, spectacular setting, was that path along the bluff, which he has preserved for all of us. So this is the path before there was much out there. And then this next slide shows the path here with a couple people enjoying it in the 1920s when a lot of the houses had been built on the bluff. So William J. Flagg died in 1898 on his 80th birthday on the day his book was published, which blows my mind. The topic of that book is probably something he thought about and worked on at Flagship after his wife died, when he spent time investigating the religions of the world and the nature of the soul. Flagg left his Sconset cottage, Flagship, to his niece, Georgina L. Judkins, who was the daughter of his brother George, the artist who was lounging on that sedan, whose house is at 12 Westminster. And for many years, Flagship was owned by the Benchley family. It's now the home of Amos and Barbara Hostetter, who are here tonight, and from whom I hope to learn a little more about the house. Rosalie, the niece, inherited all of Flagg's bronze, cloisonne, porcelain, and earthenware bric-a-brac, and all ceramic objects of ornament of every kind. He left lots of material goods to a lot of people. All of this bric-a-brac and probably very valuable ceramic ware was from his New York apartment. And Rosalie and Georgina were among the 16 nieces and nephews who were heirs to the rest of Flagg's estate, which was considerable. In 1900, there was some talk among the heirs of building a hotel on Flagg land. I've seen information about that in the newspaper, but we know that did not happen. And then in 1911, at a meeting of Flagg's heirs in New York, it was decided that the plan that he had made of Sankaty Heights, those 87 lots, needed some revision. And the Enquirer and Mirror reported, nearly all the lots have been made larger by this rearrangement. And instead of the narrow roadway of 30 feet between front and rear lots, this road has now been laid out at 100 feet wide and the width maintained up to the lighthouse fence. It has been suggested that the new boulevard be called Flagg Avenue in reference to the late owner of the property. In 1912, the area was resurveyed by 2 surveyors from the vineyard, assisted by Marcel Gwynn of Sconset. It took them 8 days, and according to their calculation, they walked over 160 miles surveying Flagg land. And once again, the newspaper reported that the new boulevard would be named Flagg Avenue. So it's interesting to note that the Sanborn insurance maps of Nantucket, which were published, first one of Sconset was 1898, and then there was one in 1904. Those early maps of the area labeled the road Baxter's Road early on. And William Baxter, you all know, was a well-known Sconseter who lived at Shenunga, very famous character. He had also died in 1898, the same year that William Flagg did. And apparently, everyone was already referring to the avenue that led to the lighthouse as Baxter's Road. And the name stuck. It was never called Flagg Avenue officially. So there's consequently no memorial to William Flagg in Sconset. But perhaps we need to do something about that. Thank you. And does anybody have any questions? I'd be happy to answer them if I can, or we can talk over lemonade. I can't see anybody. There.
Do you know anything about the whole yoga thing?
Well, I got a copy of the book, which I started to read. It's really interesting. I don't know what his interest in world religions, where that came from. He was an interesting person. Don't really know, but I'm happy to loan you my copy if you'd like to read it. Yes?
What year was the lighthouse built?
Pardon me?
What year was the lighthouse built?
Oh, the lighthouse, 1850, 4950. Yeah. Well, thank you. Oh, there's one more.
Name all the lanes with the girls' names?
Well, Well, Rosalie's, I know, obviously was named for his niece, but that's the only connection that I'm aware of. I'm sorry, I'm not talking into this. It's the only connection I'm aware of with his family was Rosalie's Lane. Unlike Underhill, who, had a couple streets named. Yes?
It's almost inconceivable that he and Underhill didn't have some relationship or feelings. Right? It's actually interesting to think, okay, 'cause we were both developing Route 87 plots.
Right. Yeah.
Underhill had, a very significant number of plots as well.
Right.
But there's nothing about their interaction or
I have been unable to find any information about any interaction between Underhill and Flagg, but, they were virtually the same age. They were both attorneys. They both had vineyards. They both came to Sconset and had, real estate development, so they must have had some sort of interaction, but I haven't been able to document anything. Uh-huh. Yes.
If you want to recognize Mr. Flagg, maybe you could have the William J. Flagg poll.
I don't know if everybody heard that, but it's been suggested that in memory of William J. Flagg, we should have a William J. Flagg poll. It's a great idea. But
And Betsy, you don't really know why he came here in the first
no, that's, there were other, men of industry and wealth from the Midwest, particularly Detroit, who came to Nantucket in that era, but he was from Cincinnati. And they probably knew somebody. There's some he may have brought some other people here too, and Paul Judy knows more about that, because his wife, Eliza Longworth, had some Longworth relatives Paul, I'm going to get this wrong, who married into the Nichols family of Main Street, Sconset. So, but I don't know what brought him here. It's, he loved his cabin in the woods in Ohio, and this was sort of the opposite of a cabin in the woods. He was a man of contradiction. I don't know. Yes.
During his lifetime, how many of the lots were built at home?
Not that many, really. And the Bluff really developed after cars were allowed on the island, in 1918. So there are late 19th century houses on the Bluff, but it really took off when people were able to get to their property a little more easily. Yeah. Yes?
Is there evidence to the urban legend or maybe village legend that the buyers of the lots along Baxter bought both the front lot and the back lot?
Well, I'm sure some of them probably did, but that would take a lot of deed research to verify. I honestly don't know. Michael May's done a lot of research on the North Bluff area. He might be able to answer that better than me, if he wants to. You can. Okay. Yeah, it's, deed research is complicated and it takes a long time, but you discover a lot. So it could be that more than a few did purchase both lots. I'm sorry? Oh, no, it's just the color of that particular postcard. It's shingled. It's not brick, this first house. Yeah. Yes.
A comment that we own a house that's kind of at your beginning photo at the very back, and then there's
Oh.
3 houses in a row.
Right.
And those 3 houses obviously still exist. In fact, one of them I rode down on my bicycle here with a woman. They're I think the only family on the Bluff that is still a relative of the original owner.
Owner.
In 1995, the Gammon family. But I think it'd be interesting to see why those 3 existed in a row, but nothing existed between Flagg's home and those 3. I don't know if they were all relatives or related or not, but when we
Right.
renovated our house, there was beneath behind the drywall was a note that was a love letter basically between someone from our house, the original owner Davis, and our neighbors, the Healy's, or the Gammon family that I just mentioned.
Right.
So I think it's kind of interesting that why they chose to develop
That.
of the 87
Right, those particular ones.
What names the streets all are? Do we have people that know the answers to those street names?
Well, I don't, but no, it's an area for investigation. That's why we have the Sconset Historical Research Group.
One of the benefits of being a member is that when you ask a question, we can't
Right,
ask you to
right. More questions? Yeah?
I'm interested in who was the brain behind the railroad?
Who was the brains behind the railroad?
Yeah, it wasn't that railroad.
Right. Well, it was a company of men. We have there are books written about the railroad that I could refer you to that go into great detail about that. It was not Flagg and it was not Underhill, although Underhill made some speeches about the railroad. But yeah.
That railroad bridge is still there.
Right.
Betsy, you might mention that the ultimate end of the Flagg family situation was the sale of these, how many did you say, 14, 16 beneficiaries?
Oh, 16. 16 nieces and nephews.
16 east-west strips of land that ultimately David Gray bought for the golf course.
Right.
That was the end of the Flagg family's investment in Wisconsin.
Right. Thanks, Paul. Okay, yeah. All right. I think it's time for lemonade. So thank you, everybody.